So welcome to my tutorial on microservices. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris Richardson. I actually got my start in programming back in the mid-80s, building Lisp systems, working on garbage collectors, runtimes, compilers, all the way up the stack to IDEs. Lisp, of course, being an early functional and then object-oriented language. Eventually, I ended up programming in Java, and then back in 2006, I wrote the book Pojos in Action, which is all about writing applications with Spring and Hibernate, which back then were revolutionizing how you do enterprise Java development. And then in 2007, I started playing around with EC2, which back then was this obscure service, which of course, as we all know, has created the cloud computing industry. I first created an open source project, which then evolved into Cloud Foundry, which was a platform as a service for deploying Java applications on EC2. Cloud Foundry was acquired by SpringSource back in 2009, shortly before SpringSource was acquired by VMware. And I was there for 4.5 years, and then 2 years ago I left, and these days I focus on all things to do with microservices. So I do consulting and training around microservices. I also am the founder of a microservices startup called Eventuate, and we're building a platform that makes it easy for application developers to write microservices. So what's this tutorial about? Well, it aims to answer a few key questions, namely, what are microservices? When should you use them? And also importantly, when should you not use them? And then if you do decide to use them, how do you use them? What are the various design problems that you will encounter when you use microservices and how to solve those problems? There's a particular emphasis on using an event-driven microservice architecture. As you're going to see, an event-driven architecture solves a number of problems that often arise within a microservice architecture. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at that. And then finally, we're going to answer the question, how do you take your monolithic application and migrate it into a microservice architecture? And I'm going to talk about a strategy for doing that incrementally. So over time, you can gradually move your monolith into a set of microservices. A lot of the tutorial is structured around a pattern language. So various design solutions that you need to use are actually expressed as a set of patterns. So for instance, there are the core patterns. Do you use a monolithic architecture or do you use a microservice architecture? There are various deployment patterns. Do you deploy your microservices in Docker containers or do you use virtual machines? And what are the various trade-offs? There's also a set of communication patterns because when you're building microservices, you're building a distributed system. And so there's a whole host of inter-process communication issues that you need to address. So for instance, do you use messaging or do you use a remote procedure call mechanism? There's also a set of patterns around discovery. So for instance, imagine you're writing some code that needs to make an HTTP request to a service. What's the network location of that service? In other words, what's the host name and the port number for that service? In a microservice architecture, that's no longer a trivial problem. You can't use a configuration file containing a set of hardwired IP addresses and ports. So there's a bunch of different mechanisms for addressing that. And then finally, at sort of the application level, there's a set of really interesting problems around data management. And you're going to see how an event-driven architecture can be used to solve those problems. So here's the outline. So part one is just kind of covering the core ideas around microservices. As I said, it's very much driven by a set of patterns. And then part two is digging into the topic of event-driven microservices. And then part three looks at the process of refactoring a monolithic application into a set of microservices. So here's a set of links that you can look at for more information. So in my GitHub repo, there's various examples of microservices applications. There's the website microservices.io, where you can find the pattern language. There's also my blog, plainoldobjects.com, where I occasionally post articles on microservices. And then there's also my consulting company and my startup websites as well. So let's get going.